when we see a child who may be fawning or really kind of overcompensating and being super compliant, it's kind of the job of the person who's close to them that they do trust. Like, we always have to start with trust. Trust is the foundation of all of us.
Tell us a little bit more about this trauma response and how that might show up, because we now know that it's the way we reacted to that situation. And how could it manifest, and what are some of the things, if we're caregivers in schools or in foster care, what are some of the things that we're looking at?
Right. Well, I think also what a lot of people don't understand is that trauma isn't only those big, heavy, super shocking events like a car accident or a house fire, but there can also be interpersonal trauma and developmental trauma, which happens to children within their relationships. So this is trauma because of a relationship around the child, either maybe neglect, emotional or physical neglect, or any type of abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and loss. So whether it's family separation, whether it's divorce, whether it's foster care, kinship care, these things can all be very traumatic for children. So I just want to point that out, that it's not only those major, major events. And then from there, a child who experiences this type of adversity may have symptoms. And those symptoms are often hard to figure out because it's very much based on their behavior. So a lot of their ability to express their thoughts and feelings about it when they're a child just aren't there. And so they have to sort of act out through their behavior what they're feeling and thinking on the inside. And those symptoms could be hyper-vigilance, which looks like a child who is always on alert, always knows every single thing that is happening in front of them, on the side of them, and behind them. They are just hyper alert to everything in their environment. That would be a hyper-vigilant response. And that's because the body and brain is trying to protect itself from future harm based off of what it knows from the past. There could also be fight, flight, and freeze and fawn responses. Fight response for trauma would look like a child who's aggressive, who's hurting himself or others. It could be the flight response, which is a child who is running away, hiding, unable to communicate their needs and desires with others, avoids things, people, and experiences. The freeze response, which is like more of like a dissociation, where a child will actually go somewhere else in their mind in order to avoid thinking or feeling the sensations they're having because of the trauma. And this might look like a child who just stares off into space for significant amounts of time each day, or doesn't remember things that you asked them to do or told them to do. They may lose track of time and not remember things that happened. And unfortunately, when this sort of response happens, children often get in trouble a lot because they look like they're lying, or they look like they're being disobedient. And really it's because they didn't hear what was said because they physically weren't present in the moment. Their brain was somewhere else, sort of distracting them from reality. So that's, a common one that we see with kids with extreme trauma. And then there's the fawn response, which is newer response to add to the list. But this looks like children who befriend and sort of attend to their abusers, and it's a response to protect themselves. So they may be so afraid to rock the boat, so afraid to speak up, so afraid to get in trouble, get a bad grade, speak up for themselves, that they just are extremely compliant. And they look like the child who has straight A's and is captain of the cheerleading team and, has it all together and never fights, never argues, never pushes back. That is because they are scared to death that if they do, they will be hurt in some way, abandoned, rejected, or abused. And then, on top of that, we have those somatic symptoms that look like stomach aches, headaches, heart palpitations, difficulty connecting with others in relationships, that disobedient sort of pushing back, what we would call disobedient, but is really, a need for control over their environment to feel safe. And there's lots of others I could go into, but I'll stop there for now.
What you just shared, two things pop up for me. The new phrase, which I've not heard of, but it makes perfect sense to me. When we have children who are hyper-vigilant, so when they're hyper-vigilant and looking for safety, constantly looking at the situation, reading situations, they might read it correctly sometimes and not so correctly, increasing their response, flight, fight, freeze, or what is the last one? How do you spell it? Because I couldn't understand the word.
Which one? Fawn?
Fawn.
Yes, like a little deer, like a little fawn, someone who fawns over their parents or is very easy and compliant. They look like the perfect child, so to speak. The problem with trauma is that we know from research that children actually and adults will misinterpret facial expressions, and they more often see faces that are actually neutral as threatening or aggressive. They can unfortunately misinterpret a situation or a person. They can see them as a threat based upon their past experiences with aggressive people or harmful people, and actually see threat that isn't there. And so they may go into a trauma response, that those fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses, when it's not necessarily needed.
I want to sort of reiterate this once again. The fawn response is where someone is verbally, physically, mentally, sexually abusive to this person, this child. Mm-hmm. They will try, in order to survive, they will be kind and friendly. And in doing that, they're kind of between a rock and a hard place, because if they speak up, they're going to be in trouble. And if they don't speak up, they're feeling internal pressures and challenges that really then are, bottled up. And over time, that can be overwhelming, and eventually it shows up. So you and I were talking about, sometimes we're in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, and now it all comes crashing down. Yeah. So this fawn response, it's a safety response, but the child has taken all of the pressures of the situation. They feel guilt. They probably feel shame. They are overcompensating, and they're not sure when they are going through life who to trust and who not to trust. And they forgive people so much easier to be hurt again and again. And this is a big, constant challenge. It's something I understand as well. How can we support children in very young age when they have this sort of a conflict, maybe in kinship, foster, or adoptive family, or CASA, as an advocate? What are some of the things we can do? Because this young person is not showing any signs of, they're just going happy-go-lucky, like you said, cheerleader, getting good grades. So they're masking. They literally have a mask on. And I can see that.
100%. I am a CASA volunteer, and I've been one for 6 years now. And when I started out with my girls, who the case is closed now, and they did find permanency, but when I started with them, I would talk to the social worker and I would talk to the foster parents, and they would say, they're doing great. They're doing great. They're fine. They're, like, any problems, any behavioral stuff at home, like, what's going on? No. They're wonderful. Like, they're quote unquote perfect. They're fine. They're doing great. And I'm like, okay. They've had extensive amounts of trauma, but you're not seeing any of the signs. And I knew, because of my work, that was a red flag for me, actually. So when you know that a child has a history of serious trauma, whether they're in foster care or kinship care, or were adopted, that in and of itself is a trauma, right? To be removed from your family, to be removed from your biological people, that in and of itself is a trauma. And a lot of people forget that. They think that the trauma is just the abuse or neglect that the child sustained that got them out of the family. But that's also a trauma when the child is removed or separated from primary biological family. We forget that those things are also trauma. And so when we see a child who may be fawning or really kind of overcompensating and being super compliant, it's kind of the job of the person who's close to them that they do trust. Like, we always have to start with trust. Trust is the foundation of all of us. And what's disrupted in trauma is our sense of trust in ourselves and the world. And children are always asking themselves, am I safe and is the world safe? And if the answer is no to either of those questions, that can bring up the trauma responses. And so first and foremost, children need at least one, and we know from research by Harvard University that one caregiver, one person in the child's life who can help them feel safe physically and emotionally, not just physically safe, but emotionally safe as well, and that they know they can count on and trust to be honest with them, to be there for them, to show up when they say they're going to, and to be committed to the child, that we can begin to mitigate the impact of whatever trauma they experienced. And so that's where everyone has to start the healing process for children.